just introduce yourself.
Oh, well, I am essentially I was a care assistant for 17 years, and then I had a stroke-like thing and couldn't walk very well for quite some time. So I went to university late and did my undergraduate degree in English literature and my postgraduate degree in early modern studies, 1300 to 1700. And at this point, I started getting quite annoyed with having to do all of my analysis through various postmodern inspired theories, like post-colonial theory and queer theory and all the other sort of studies. And at the same time, feminism that I'd always been a part of was starting to become very intersectional in a way that was culturally relative, and I felt was significantly letting down the Muslim and ex-Muslim feminists that I was particularly keen on supporting as a critic of religion at that time. And so we fell out quite profoundly. And these two things, this activism that I was seeing arising, um, it's quite clearly matched the postmodern derived theories that I had been encountering at university, and why I left and didn't do my PhD, because I simply couldn't do one that I'd be proud of. And so I started writing about this and reading more about it, and then people just started turning up to my Twitter account and my blog and saying, "Would you like to write about this for us?" And sometimes we'll even pay you money. So I thought, oh, okay, that's quite nice. So that was when I became quite a serious sort of ongoing writer about critical theories and liberalism. The main problem that I identify with these theories, apart from the fact that um, they're insane, um, is evidence-based epistemology and consistently liberal ethics is what I've always stood for. It's why I've been a critic of religion, because I don't believe that faith is a good epistemology. I don't believe that a lot of the stuff that comes out of religious texts, often from thousands of years ago, is compatible with liberal values, the rights of women, of same-sex attracted people, etc. And in the same way, I don't think the ideas that are coming out of postmodern derived theories are rooted in reality. They have a rejection of objective reality in favor of very specific lived experiences, theories, and perceptions. That's not a good epistemology. And the liberal principles that I so much value and which and which our liberal democracies depend on are fundamentally challenged by these perceptions that we are all socialized into certain ideas. We cannot evaluate ideas for ourselves. We aren't individuals and rational agents who can be trusted with our own minds. We don't have a shared humanity. We have to think constantly in terms of standpoint epistemology and identity-based knowledge that's theorized, often for people of those identity groups entirely against their wishes. And we must, of course, suppress speech um, in order to achieve social justice, because we're apparently all governed by dominant discourses which perpetuate systems like patriarchy and white supremacy and transphobia and homophobia. And so it's imperative to control how people think and speak and do unconscious bias training and cancel people. So this was all arising. I noticed it really around 2010 in the universities. By 2013, it was starting to have an impact on broader society, and 2015 it really kind of exploded into into mainstream culture. And so that since then I've been writing about that. And yes, I wrote first of all for Aereo. And when the owner of Aereo decided that he couldn't carry on with it, I took over Aereo, and it was very important to me then to try to get a lot of diverse viewpoints in from people all over the political spectrum. The analysis of various sort of algorithms which looked at our content said that Aereo was slightly left-leaning, but that was not ever my intention. I did actively try to recruit more conservative writers, but I think we had more people, more academics on the liberal and socialist left who were looking for an outlet in support of freedom of speech and viewpoint diversity than we had conservatives at that time. So we did lean only very slightly to the left, and that was an important project. I think it was about 75% academics explaining their topic to non-academics, which I think was very useful. It gave space for longer form sort of treatments of social issues, and the other 25 was absolutely anybody else who had something to say and could say it well. So I very much enjoyed working for Aereo. I gave it over to Iona when the big kind of inflection point with critical social justice happened in the summer of 2020. And after the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests and various companies, celebrities, social media, mainstream media really started pushing this the critical social justice narrative, and policies and training programs were being imposed on everybody. And I'd just published Cynical Theories at that time. And so we got numerous, so many hundreds, and no, it's not an exaggeration, it's really hundreds of emails of people saying to me, I'm being expected to affirm these things at work that I don't think are true and I don't think are ethical and I don't know what to do. And so that was when we formed Counterweight, because I was trying to triage all of this and trying to prioritize people who are in immediate danger of being fired. How can you address this? And so then Carrie Clark arrived and said, well, first Kevin Lowe arrived, and he's always with me, bless him, and said and created the Discord server I could kind of pour people into to try to bring them together. And we had a clinic in the middle for people in immediate danger. And then Carrie arrived and started sorting people into groups and arranging the relevant resources for them. And we kind of dealt with about 100 active cases a month of people in danger of being fired. But we had thousands more in the Discord server, and that's where the Counterweight handbook comes from. But I realize I've kind of jumped over the grievance studies affair and cynical theories. So would you like me to go back a bit?
Well, yeah, just quickly on the grievance studies affair, I suppose.
Yeah, so and as I was writing about these things, I was very interested and admiring of James Lindsay's work at that point. And so I wrote quite a few sort of favourable reviews of it. I promoted quite a lot of his stuff. We got talking. He asked me to write with him our manifesto against the enemies of modernity, which was essentially a manifesto against the enemies of liberalism. But we didn't want to, at that point, use the word liberalism because of the way it's understood in the US to mean left. And our manifesto really looked at threats coming from the left and the right to liberal democracy. And that got quite a lot of attention. When James and Peter did their first hoax paper, The Conceptual Penis, and they found afterwards that it was a bit confounded by being I mean, it was a peer-reviewed journal, but it was also one in which you had to pay to publish, so they couldn't be entirely sure whether it had been that it wasn't predatory. I don't think it was, but it's, you know, it could fall in that. So they wanted to do a bigger um sort of test of things by selecting only journals that did not accept payment, that were at the top of their rankings in these studies ideas. So they're not at the top of the ranking of journals generally, but in their kind of subfield. So Gender, Place and Culture is the leading feminist geography journal. There's not a problem as such in geography, but feminist geography has a problem, really does. That's where our dog humping paper was. And Hypatia is the leading journal in feminist philosophy. And there's not necessarily a problem in philosophy. Well, there's a lot of problems in philosophy, but and you know, this was a particular problem. So we aimed our papers at that, and we brought together a lot of the all the worst ideas, all the issues that we were trying to draw attention to, had been trying to draw attention to quite directly, by just straightforwardly criticizing them, and brought them all together and used them to make arguments which should have been quite clearly not rooted in evidence, should have been quite clearly unethical, unreasonable, and produce terrible papers, and see what the journal reviewers advised us to do with them. And they invariably advised us to make them more ideologically biased and unreasonable. So that was an interesting experiment, and for me, the main purpose of engaging with that, well, I will admit a guilty secret. I actually really like postmodernism. I like playing with it. There's something very fun and inventive with it, but I think as an art form, it would be absolutely fine. But as a way of managing social engineering and trying to understand society, it's absolutely disastrous. So I jumped at the opportunity to be able to write papers using it. And it also was, we were trying at that point to address those on the liberal left mostly, who weren't in favour of the critical social justice theories, but really thought that they weren't the big problem. You know, that the problem was coming from the right. There were always a few mad papers, always a few overzealous students. This isn't really a big deal. You know, we need to maintain solidarity against the right. And we wanted to show them that it really was a big deal, that it was undermining the integrity of the left, the integrity of the university, even more importantly. And so that was what we were trying to show the problem to exist at that point, and also show that our criticism of it wasn't based in some shallow reactionary understanding of the theories, but that we understood them well enough to get published in the leading journals of them. So we established ourselves as legitimate, knowledgeable critics. After that had been done, we wrote, James and I wrote cynical theories to explain the different kinds of theories, to break down post-colonial, queer, critical race, intersectional feminism, disability and fact studies, and then the culmination of all of those into what was just called social justice scholarship, to really make them accessible to people who are just mystified by the language. And then Counterweight was my way of acting on that. So I would say the grievance studies affair was showing the problem to exist. Cynical theories was explaining the problem, and Counterweight and the Counterweight handbook is addressing the problem. So I've really been quite single-minded for quite some time.
Hmm. Do you think you don't have to answer this, by the way, or I don't have to publish it, but since you mentioned James Lindsay, you admired him at that time.
Mm. I couldn't really disagree much more strongly with the stances that he's taking now. That's what I will say on the record.
So yeah, so you said that this really started exploding around 2015. So where
Mm.
are we now then? Because as you said, you've been doing this for a long time. are we in a better position than we were?
We are. We are. I think there are definite signs that we are past peak woke. There are positive indications in the US and the UK, particularly in the UK, that people have really tired of woke. It's lost a significant amount of its social prestige. I think this comes down in part to authoritarian trans activism, because that sort of broke the bounds of demanding that people have the right to address and present themselves as they see fit, and into kind of demanding that other people affirm beliefs that they have the right not to hold, that they monitor their own language, and the creation that sort of an access to women's spaces in places where this is dangerous, such as in contact sports and in prisons particularly. I think a lot of people, a great sort of coming together of people who were gender critical feminists and who were conservatives and who were liberals and who were libertarians and who were all over the political spectrum, just saying that this now is it is definitely straying into authoritarianism and into harm. And so there was a backlash against that. That backlash, unfortunately, I think has become a backlash not against a particular kind of authoritarian trans activist and their theories, but against the people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transsexual, transgender, transvestite more broadly. And we see this in measurable ways, particularly in the US, where support for same-sex relationships has dropped 7%. Um, and this is being used as a kind of slippery slope argument. We allowed same-sex marriage, and now the teachers are deciding what gender your children should be. And no, that is not how anything happened. But that's extremely troubling. But that was what we were actually trying to prevent by trying to keep this form of activism liberal, and the overarching rule of let people believe, speak, live as they see fit, provided it harms no one else nor denies them the same freedoms, was to prevent this backlash. So that's a worry, and I'm addressing more now what has been referred to as the woke right. And then I think another very important turning point was after the Hamas massacre,
Hmm.
in which certain leading lights of the critical social justice movement went way beyond criticism of Israel as a state and its behavior, and into justifying rape and torture and mutilation and downright anti-Semitism, which led a lot of people who had still been inclined to think it was a movement for social justice to recognize that it wasn't.
Hmm. Yeah, just on the gender debate, I know one of your more recent Twitter uh, fights was with some gender critical people who were unhappy with your particular stance on the gender issue.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and you even see some of them who are allying themselves with those very people in the US that you mentioned,
Mm.
which I think is a worrying trend.
Yeah,
So,
there are several strands in the gender critical movement at the moment. There are the old radical feminists with whom I have disagreement because they are very anti-men. They believe that we live in a misogynistic patriarchal rape culture, which I cannot agree with. They read everything through patriarchy, and that they regard me as a traitor for not believing that that's true. So I've had my disagreements with them. And then there are the sort of gender critical feminists who aren't so radical. Um, who I get on better with, or the socialist feminists, and they are still staying very securely on the left. And then there are those with a much more sort of liberal element whose concern really is just for the harm aspect. They don't have an animosity against people who identify as trans and go about their lives. They do want to protect women's spaces and sports, and so they cannot be blamed for the surge of gender criticals towards the populist and the sort of far right movements. But at the same time, some of the feminists who previously were of a radical kind have moved into a populist and sort of far right attitude, and then other people who are sort of populist, sort of by nature, have taken on the term gender critical. And so you'll get somebody like Kelly J. Keane, the Posy Parker, who will quite clearly say that she's not a feminist, that she doesn't care about things like abortion rights, reproductive freedom, the rights of people to be gender non-conforming. In fact, she's quite critical of people dressing in non gender conforming ways. But she is still seen as a leading light of the gender critical movement, which is undermining it to a significant extent. But we are seeing more principled gender critical feminists stand up against the populists, and I'm pleased to see that. But I'm not myself gender critical. I don't actually care about people. I don't. This is something that's very frustrating to me, and the reason that I get accused of being a fence sitter, and also people keep trying to work out what my real motives are. What do I really believe? Do I believe in true trans? Do I support autogynephiles? And I am a liberal. There was actually a great long live stream of people poring over my writing, trying to work out what I actually believe, because I must believe something on the grounds of gender critical or gender affirming. And no, that it did not seem to occur to any of them that the pattern they were seeing is liberal. So I will oppose authoritarian trans activists who are trying to make people who don't believe in gender identity pretend to have one, and dictate the way that they can speak and what they must believe. But I will also oppose the gender criticals who start also trying to dictate how people may speak, what pronouns they may use, how men may dress. I'm consistently opposing the authoritarianism.
Hmm. Well, that you mentioned the sort of socialist group within the gender critical faction, which leads me on to workers' rights,
Mm,
which leads me on to counterweight again.
yeah.
Where is counterweight now? And well, you can talk about the handbook as well.
Yeah, the counterweight was a really a kind of emergency triage response. So we all came together. There were about 25 of us in the end to produce resources for people for practical guidance and help take on individual cases and write things and just generally get stuff out there to help in that emergency. I took on too much because in the end I was doing 100% of the casework because it involved often really addressing the theories on their own terms, and I was in the end the only person able to do that. So I was kind of working 14-hour days until I burnt out completely, had another kind of stroke-like incident and a spectacular nervous breakdown. And so at this point, counterweight, it's the counterweight people are still there. A lot of the resources have moved to the Institute of Liberal Values, and the academic team are there, Mike Burke and Elizabeth Spivak. Carrie Clark and Kevin Lowe, they still work with me. Carrie has worked with Don't Divide Us, the Free Speech Union. She's doing a lot of work with GenSpect at the moment. Kevin continues to back me up in my stuff, and Harriet is working for an organization that brings people with differences together to discuss them. So she's in her element. So they're all still out there. They're all still doing their thing. I'm still connected to all of them. But Counterweight as an organization was really a kind of immediate emergency response thing.
Mm. And so tell us about the book then, which I think what in the subtitle it goes back to what you were saying about being consistently liberal and anti-authoritarian.
Mm.
I think you've outlined, well, we've discussed some of the unprincipled strategies for dealing with CSJ.
Yeah.
And the book is about, as it says, principled strategies for navigating all of this. So,
Yeah. Exactly. So I'm coming very much from a liberal humanist perspective. I don't require everybody to be liberal humanists. You know, part of being liberal is letting people not be liberal, and also talking to them and kind of having this viewpoint diversity. But the handbook is based on I think where a lot of us can converge, whether we consider ourselves liberal or not, on anti-authoritarian. So it comes from it had the sort of two premises really, that to address this you have to come from a place of knowledge, not ignorance. You have to show that you understand the theories that are being imposed on you, not in a greatly in-depth way. I've sort of given enough information in the first three chapters for people to have a fairly solid understanding of how the worldview works. And then you have to come from a place of principle when you're opposing it, so that you're very clear. I'm not opposing social justice. I'm not. I support, and this was the basic requirement we had at Counterweight. We're there for anybody who recognizes that the equal value of people of all races, sexes, sexualities, etc. But wants to reject discrimination from their own values, not from anybody else's. So we weren't there for people who thought that racial equality was a bad thing, or that we should have a patriarchy. So that's a very basic thing, and very few people did believe that. So when we sort of go through principles, because I think quite often now people don't, liberals particularly, we've kind of forgotten how to argue for and defend our principles. We've become quite complacent that things just quite obviously seem to be illiberal. They seem to be wrong, and so people will respond to these authoritarian policies and training programs with that you're denying my freedom of belief, and that's racist, and you're making assumptions about me. And what they really need to do is step back from engaging with critical social justice on its own terms, and come from a place of strength with their own principles. And how I often describe this is, if you're in a workplace and somebody is trying to say to you, homosexuality is a sin. Do you engage with that by saying, well, actually, no, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, you'll see that Jesus never mentions homosexuality and he talks a lot about divorce? Or do you step back from that and say, you have the right to believe that, and I support your right to believe that. I myself am not a Christian, or I'm not a Christian who believes that. I don't hold those beliefs, and I don't have any responsibility to do so. And that is what I try to get people to do in the Counterweight handbook, is don't fall into the trap of defending yourself on the terms of critical social justice, because that's already theorized. Any kind of disagreement is already theorized as you having unconscious bias, or a selfish and entitled wish to preserve your own privilege. And you can't get anywhere that way. Instead, say to your HR department, to your employer, to whoever is trying to impose this on you. Yes, I understand this framework. I share its aim to oppose racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry, but I have a different set of beliefs. How can we work together without either of us having to pretend to believe things we don't? Now, typically, if you've got a CSJ environment, that's not going to be satisfactory, but actually forcing them to say, well, you can't hold your own value systems, you have to hold this one, will often give employers a pause for thought. They really don't want to say that. So kind of putting them into a corner where they have to either say, okay, you can oppose liberalism, you can oppose racism from a liberal perspective, or say, actually, no, you can't. You're not allowed to believe in free will and individual autonomy. You have to believe in this, which gives them pause, because firstly, there's kind of legal precedent there for sort of respected philosophical beliefs, and also it often just wakes quite a lot of them up to the fact that it is authoritarian.
Hmm. So is it a form of secularism then that you're advocating?
Yes, I would say so, and I've used that parallel quite a lot, because as we know, a lot of secularism is not the same thing as atheism. It is a belief in a separation of church and state. It both protects the believer's right to believe, and it protects everybody else's right not to have that belief imposed on them and not to have it established in any institution. So I have argued that this principle of secularism really needs to be expanded to other ideologies. You know, woke specifically, we need separation of woke and state. We need to have an understanding that this should not be institutionalized. People should not be required to write an equity, diversity, and inclusion statement in order to get a job in a university, any more than they should be required to state the Apostles' Creed. They must be able, there's a baseline expectation that is reasonable to have. You will not be racist, sexist, or demonstrate other forms of prejudice and discrimination while you are working in this environment. But the way from which the ethical grounds from which you do this must be down to your own personal conscience. And I've helped quite a lot of employers write policies um, from this perspective, which protects not only sort of immutable characteristics, but also philosophical and political beliefs.
So let me put an opposite case then. Why, I mean, is this really such a big problem? We've got Putin and Ukraine and Israel and Gaza and climate change and Trump and all of this. Why
Mm.
focus on something that at least has a noble principle at its heart that wants to do the best? Is it really such a threat to democracy in the ways that all of these other things are?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's a significant threat. I think we're seeing a significant undermining of liberal principles that have come from wokeness and have come from the reaction against it. People are increasingly polarized. They're increasingly likely to say that political violence is justified. And I think that critical social justice bears a great deal of responsibility for this, because it's broken down that detente that we had, where there was a general consensus growing that to be overtly racist, for example, was both stupid and unethical. And now that there has been so much sort of condemnation of white people, and there's been a kind of pathologization of masculinity, we're seeing people now feeling emboldened to really be quite openly misogynistic, to be quite openly racist. So I think it is a big thing, but there's two parts to that question. And people often ask, like, is this the most important thing? Well, no, it isn't, probably. I think world hunger would probably be the most important thing. But the reason that I address critical social justice specifically is because that's what I've studied for 14 years, and I think I'm quite good at it. So people will often ask me, why are you not commenting? I was thinking about this before we spoke because somebody raised it. Why are you not commenting on the Israel Gaza? Why are you not? Or they'll ask me to come and talk about COVID or climate change, and I mean, some people seem to think it's a good thing when sort of cultural critics suddenly become experts in epidemiology, climate science, the workings of the EU, or international politics and war crimes. But I'm not one. I have absolutely no expertise in any of those areas. And I've written a piece on this called "Can We Stop Politicizing Things, Incomparable Things in Clusters?" Because it is often assumed that because I'm critical of critical social justice, I will also be skeptical of COVID and of climate change. I will be a Leave voter. And actually, I'm none of those things. I'm not an expert on any of those things, but I'm going. I don't see good reason not to go with the scientific consensus on climate change. If given good reason, I think that'll come out of the scientific community. If there's which is not noticeably woke, if there is a reason to question the consensus on man-made climate change, and I will support anybody. I mean, what I tend to do in these kinds of areas is where I don't have expertise, is try to support organizations and groups that do in protecting themselves from ideological bias and censorship. So that's what I do for GenSpect. For example, I know very little about gender medicine, as it's often called, but I am there to essentially try to ensure that empirical evidence-based research, which can be of use to young people experiencing gender distress, is not sabotaged either by trans activists, gender critical feminists, or social conservatives.
Hmm. You make a good point though about how these things are clustered together.
Mm.
Um, but one quite interesting thing that I've noticed that kind of pushes against that is the support that you've had from some socialists.
Mm.
And I think that's the aspect of workers' rights. I mean, to an extent, would you class what you've done with Counterweight and the Counterweight Handbook as socialistic enterprises?
Yes, I would. I write as a liberal, and I deliberately make my arguments and my case accessible to all liberals, because I think it's very important that we all come together. At the moment, this is the big issue, but on a political level, I have never made a secret of the fact that I am economically left. And so that is how I vote. And when I speak about economics and those kind of things, I'm not a socialist, because I don't believe that everything should be socially owned, but I am a socialism informed economic leftist. So yes, so socialists do support me because I make these cases, and in Counterweight it did work on that level. I was very concerned that that wokeness is essentially a capitalist, corporatist movement. It's being fueled by by corporate interests. When you have got and this was years ago when Helen Lewis wrote her piece. I think it was may even have been 2018, maybe not quite that long ago. But and she said then it was a $9 billion training industry, and this was an industry that allowed corporations to impose unconscious bias training to access the unconscious minds of their workers and retrain them. And when you're getting paid like $25,000 an hour by billion-dollar corporations to tell workers how they think, you really cannot claim to be a left-wing organization. You're betraying absolutely everything that the left has stood for.
It's like, well, the way you put it there, it's kind of like employing psychics to to train the workforce.
Yeah, and I mean it's more like sort of specifically historically, when people have had to, by law, go to church every Sunday, they've had to have catechism where they, make the right responses to the right questions. It's very much like that. And that's something that we have separated out. That's the secularism issue that we're talking about. But the Vivek Ramaswamy, who has also appears to have gone quite mad, but when he wrote Woking, um, he wrote, I think there was a very interesting part from the perspective of somebody owning one of these large corporations, where he said that once what they used to do for sort of for good PR is they'd go, we're going to go and plant trees, and then they'd have photographs taken of them all standing around holding shovels, and then they'd go to the pub. And this is, I think, precisely what the critical social justice industry is doing. For corporations, if there's inequalities there are disparities out there, rather than actually looking into things, actually doing sort of outreach things. A large tech company could, for example, if noticing that, say, in Silicon Valley, that there are very few African Americans reaching high positions in tech, could actually spend some of their resources in ensuring that poor Black communities have a laptop in their home and Wi-Fi, and that and sort of classes, homework clubs, things like that. They could actually do practical things on a socioeconomic level to make things better. But what they would rather do, I think, is say, well, I'm going to buy this anti-racist training package, then I'm putting all the responsibility onto the workers to stop this company from being racist. I look good and like I've made all these pledges, but I don't actually have to do anything to enable any social mobility.
Yeah, well, it's easier just generally speaking to police thoughts and try and enforce some ideological conformity, as if that's going to do anything to help anyone.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to do that. I think that's why people fall into the trap all the time.
Yeah.
But I wanted to, well, talking about secularism as one of those old um, non-religious words that can be broadened. Since this is the freethinker, what does it mean? And free thinking, of course, has a relationship to atheism and humanism historically, but it's also broader than that. So, what does it mean to think freely in 2024?
Okay, let me kind of steelman the critical social justice position and their sort of genuine their legitimate critiques of liberalism and kind of naive Enlightenment values. So the idea that did come out of liberal philosophy, that we are each a sort of self-made individual, a perfectly rational agent who can kind of consider each idea devoid of its context, that did arise in the Enlightenment, is quite clearly naive. And I think the kernel of truth in the critical social justice movement comes down to culture exists and it affects how we think about things. And we can see this very clearly, I would say, in discourses around homosexuality. So for hundreds of years, it was a sinful thing that people did. Then at the end of the 19th century, it became a shameful disorder that some people had. By the 80s, it was some people are gay, get over it. And now, with the sort of queer movement, actually queer is a political identity, and if you're just same-sex attracted and you're not a radical queer, then you're not actually gay at all. So so these are the discourses and how they change. So I think when we're talking about free thinking, then we always have to be very aware that we are thinking within a cultural milieu. But this is how things have always worked, and this is what liberalism has always done, and it's how things change. The critical social justice and postmodernism did not invent deconstructing grand narratives. We have been doing that for centuries, as we've got rid of theocracy, as we've sort of recognized the profound ethical problems with slavery, with colonialism, with patriarchy. We've been challenging grand narratives and moving things on because we have had a culture of free speech. And there are always a number of discourses in society. The postmodernists, they tend to act as though there is just one dominant discourse and we're all empty vessels being filled up with it. And no, it's like an evolution. So a seed will form and somebody will question an idea. And if we look back at how they questioned it then, we can still see that there are quite significant problems with it. Like Charles Darwin, for example, he assumed that women had evolved to be less intelligent than men. And he was a man of his time. I don't think, given the evidence that he has now, that he would hold to that, but he had planted a seed there um, of evolution by natural selection, which had been built on, and we now know that men and women have equal intelligence, but did have different variations and slightly different cognitive abilities. Or if we look at something like Uncle Tom's Cabin, we see that Harriet Beecher Stowe then was very progressive for her time. She opposed slavery, and she valued the humanity of Black people. But there are also some flaws in there where she did not, for example, where the Uncle Tom thing comes from, seemed to recognize that Black enslaved people would care about their own children, actually more than in the same way that white people would. So she's kind of, but she's made a progressive jump there, and then that can be built on, and then it's built on, and then it's built on. So I'm rambling away now, but let me make something more concise and quotable. To be a free thinker is to look at all the ideas that are around you, to evaluate them, to try to build on them, to think freely about all the ideas that are available to you, and to try to form your own ideas and contribute to that chain of the advance of knowledge and the progress of human rights.
Yeah, I always find that interesting, those naive, actually just on Darwin, um, it's interesting that when he proposed sexual selection as an evolutionary force, he had an argument with Alfred Russel Wallace over female choice. For Darwin, female choice alone could create the peacock's tail. For Wallace, it had to be something useful. The peacock's tail had to represent something useful for the male. It can't just be an ornament that's there to impress a female.
Mm.
So, and a lot of people opposed Darwin's view of sexual selection because essentially it gave it gave the female too much power. And also, he was on the progressive side when it came to slavery as well.
Mm.
But anyway, that's just an aside.
Yeah, I didn't know that. But yes, that's quite true. Women, we don't actually need boobs.
Mm.
If The other great apes don't have them for breastfeeding. We have these because heterosexual men over the years, over the centuries, over the millennia have liked them. And so now we are encumbered by them.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, the point I was going to say was those understandings or misunderstandings of the Enlightenment are
Mm,
interesting because a lot of what people say about the Enlightenment are things that the people of the Enlightenment were saying.
mm,
They didn't um, a lot of them, well, most of them really didn't really say that we're perfectly rational agents capable of analyzing data and sifting through it all the time. You only have to read David Hume uh, to know that they saw us as culturally conditioned and individuals ruled by passions a lot of the time. And the
But
aim
the
was to,
power of reason, certainly, I think there was a lot of thought there, wasn't there?
yes,
What
yeah,
are the limits on that?
yeah,
Yeah, I didn't mean to, well, I shouldn't have implied that that naive view was an Enlightenment one. I think often I mean, you do see some people taking that naive view perfectly, um, sincerely, but more often you see people on the postmodern side saying that this is the myth of progress, and they imagine that liberals and empiricists and scientists that we think that science knows everything, when in fact if you look at the methods of science, it's specifically set out um as fallible. It's that the whole methods of it are to falsify things. Something can never be proven correct, it can only be proven incorrect. Knowledge is always provisional. It's the most humble form of knowledge production. But often people always science is overconfident in itself. Well, no, some scientists can be, and some people can use science in this naive way. Follow the science. And they're people who don't tend to understand it. And the same, I think, is true of liberalism, because as we've the the power of liberalism and the whole point of viewpoint diversity is that we have to always hold open the possibility that we are wrong. And there's a wonderful new book that's just was published a couple of days ago, Ilana Redstone, The Certainty Trap, where she looks at this and she urges us all not to be that certainty is a problem in society when people are so certain that they have things right. And she urges us to instead hold our beliefs with a degree of confidence that we consider warranted, but while leaving the door slightly ajar for um for for disconfirming information to come through. And I think that is what liberalism really does, a liberal system does. That's why, apart from the individual liberty aspect, that's why we like viewpoint diversity, is because we must never be completely sure that we are right about everything. If we look at the whole history of humans, there has never been a time when the sort of dominant ruling orthodoxy has been right about everything. We're almost certainly not right about everything now. All of the things that I am very, very confident about right now, some of them are probably wrong. I can't know which they are, but we have to keep that open.
Hmm. Well, if you've got time for just one more little question, I want you to come back to the religion aspect, the criticism of religion, because you mentioned that you were involved in all of that, and I wonder, what do you think of the landscape now? One thing I've been quite exercised about is this quote unquote new theism,
Mm,
where you have a bunch of people saying essentially Christianity is a bulwark against wokeism and China and Israel, and we need it to save the West. And most dramatically, we've seen Ayan Hirsi Ali using that argument essentially to say that she is now a Christian. Not
mm,
necessarily that she believes in any Christian doctrine, But
Did she not say that? I thought I saw Richard Dawkins saying
yeah,
that.
she said that recently. Yeah, in a debate, she said, I choose to believe
Right.
that," which is a strange way of putting it. But originally, when she first published her article last November, she didn't mention anything like that.
Mm.
It was really just the political and social uses of Christianity in defending certain civilizational ideals, I suppose.
I've yet to see any convincing evidence that any civilization was benefited by believing things that do not appear to be true. So we certainly do get some benefits from having some shared values, shared narratives. That can could kind of contribute to a sense of a common good, a cultural cohesion. But the idea that Christianity has produced this is frankly ahistoric. There are 450 denominations of Christianity for a reason, and that is because humans don't do very well at conforming to shared values and a common good. As we've seen over history, different denominations of Christians have wanted to kill each other even more than they've wanted to kill people of other faiths. So even if it weren't for the fact that we still have no good reason to think that a God exists, we have very good reason to think that many of the truth claims in the Bible are utterly false, which would not be the case if it had been inspired by an omniscient deity. There is also the fact that it simply it doesn't stand up. The argument that by returning to Christianity, even if we could, and for somebody like me, who tends to be quite a literal person, I could not, I cannot choose to believe in something and pretend what the people who so strongly urge this would have me do is pretend to believe in it or believe in it metaphorically. And I if I could ever if there was ever sufficient evidence that pretending to believe in Christianity would actually bring about world peace, then I would probably just refrain from criticizing it and go and find something else to argue against rather than actually taking that on. It doesn't make any sense to me. What we need to do, and also I think a central thing here is that when people think of Christianity as something that's better than wokeism, they are thinking very much of a form of Christianity that has been liberalized
Mm.
itself and then has been rendered optional by a liberal society. So, what they are seeing as the benefits of it is actually the impact of liberalism on it. Because if Christianity had the same institutional power that wokeism had now, it wouldn't be any better. I mean, when it has had so much institutional power, then of course there has been great violence and authoritarianism. We have not yet seen the woke burning people at the stake or torturing them into recanting because we're in a different time now. But even if Christianity only had the same power as wokeness, then I would not want to have to pretend to be Christian to get into a university, to have a job. I would not want to be cancelled if somebody found out that I'd secretly said that I didn't think God actually existed. People are comparing a liberalized and sanitized version of Christianity with an authoritarian, illiberal version of wokeness.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I think that's a nice place to end on, and unless you have anything else that you desperately want to say.
No, I don't think so. I've waffled. I'm really not good at being concise.
Well, you're a good waffler anyway. You're very a better waffler than I am. So,
Well, I don't know. You seem to go off on a roll quite well too.